Like, if I was at home, I like so many things. But I don't have like stuff here, you know? Yeah, I'm also always well, I just want to go out. Do you know what we can do? We could move Selina and just like yeah, you know, it's like yeah, but they don't have like accessories. Oh my god, I should have taken
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's class on theory of war and peace. So today we are going to deal with the most important topic of the whole class, which is trying to find out what are logically consistent explanations for war. So we saw last time that war is arguably the worst collective failure, the worst man-made disaster. And our task today will be to try to eliminate the possible coherent explanations for war. So last week we did establish war as the outcome or the prediction of some models. So you remember we investigated a few 2x2 games, like the President's Dilemma and the Steinhardt game. And indeed, those games had war as a Nash equilibrium. So, in this sense, they provided an explanation for war. However, they were extremely crude, and most importantly, they did not answer the question, how did the states arrive at the situation that is described by the game? Why didn't the opponents meet before entering that kind of strategic interaction, anticipating that type of strategic interaction, and by meeting found an agreement so as to avoid war with all its costs. So this is the basic question, because as we saw, war was a Nash equilibrium, but an inefficient outcome. So it was Pareto dominated by peaceful situations in which the opponents establish a settlement. And in general, it is so that after every war, we had some situation, and that situation could have been agreed upon before the war, without all the distractions entailed by the war. So it is an inefficient outcome. So today we are going to use a very nice contribution by James Fearon 30 years ago that clearly singles out coherent explanations for war. And the way in which we proceed is a bit similar to how we proceed when we discuss the theory of market failure. So we begin the discussion of the theory of market failure in economics by presenting the first welfare theorem, which says that the market is perfect, which says that every market equilibrium under some conditions deliver a Pareto efficient allocation, Pareto optimal allocation. And then, having understood this theorem, we say, well, actually, now we only know that if those assumptions behind the theorem are verified in reality, then we know that the market outcome will be efficient. What if those conditions, those assumptions are violated? And then we discover that if they are violated, as a rule, as a general rule, we have a market failure. That is to say, the market allocation is not Pareto efficient. So we will proceed in a similar way today. We will develop a very abstract setting in which the outcome is peace. And then we know that if the assumptions behind this model are valid, then we will not expect war. So that war can only be explained by the violation of one of those assumptions. So this is the pedagogical strategy that we follow. So we will find that we can identify 6 main explanations for war. And those 6 explanations can be further subdivided into 2 groups. The first 4 explanations are derived under the general assumption that both sides of a dispute can, in principle, commit to an international settlement of their dispute. And this is the type of explanation that we will focus on today. And then we have also 2 explanations that we will deal with next time, which relate to the case in which the commitment to a settlement is not possible. By the way, let me remind you that next week there will be no class. So next week, as I announced, I think the first week, I think November 5th, there will be no class. So, all right. As I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, we are mainly dealing with disputes that happen in a situation of international anarchy. So international anarchy means there is no world authority that can force conflicting parties to stick to some treaty or contract. That differs with the domestic case, in which the state can force its citizens to stick to contracts or rules. So how can commitment be possible then at the international level if there is no such threat of superior authority? Well, there are possibilities. There are possibilities that at least an imperfect but sufficient commitment to a treaty is credible, so that international treaties are honorable. So think about a situation in which 2 countries have a dispute about their borderline, their joint borderline. So there have been plenty of cases like this. And then, so one country would like to to englobe some territory that the other country considers its own. And then there is a possibility that they can reach a settlement that is credible, and this credibility can be reached by building such fortifications along the agreed upon borderline, such that it is virtually impossible for the other side to attack and violate the fortifications. So that by building fortifications, so stationing troops and so on along the agreed upon borderline, they credibly commit to a settlement. And the possibility is that, for instance, UN troops or troops from some neutral state are sent as peacekeeping troops on the borderline that has been agreed upon. Also in this case, if those peace troops are strong enough, this makes the international treaty credible. Another possibility is that the involved countries are actually dealing also with many other actors in the international scene, and they are interested in building a reputation for being honest and reliable, because if a state is known to be always cheating, then in many domains where synergies with other states could be developed and win-win situations could arise, the state will not be believed by the others. So that the states have an incentive to build a reputation for being trustworthy. So that also in this case, some commitment can be credible, because if I violate my word, then also in other situations, the other countries will not want to cooperate with me anymore. So you see that it is not strictly necessary to have a world police in order to enforce international treaties. In the past, a way to establish commitment was, at the time of monarchies, to send the relatives of the king to the capital of the enemy state, so that if every king would know that if he violates his word, then the relatives in the enemy state that are kind of hostages will be in danger. So this is also a way a device to create credibility. Okay. So this is the type of situations that we are going to discuss today. Next week we will focus on the case in which commitment, at least from one side, is not possible, and this will create additional problems. So, as I said before, we will obtain these explanations as violations of assumptions of a model. So I will first present the model, and then we will naturally arrive at those conclusions. So the model features two states, possibly asymmetric states, and they have a dispute. So a way to model a dispute is to say that there is an issue space that we take to be the unit interval 0, 1. So it is the set of all real numbers between 0 and 1. And states have preferences over this issue space. And in particular, they have opposing preferences. So one possibility is to interpret this more or less literally as a territory, like the Gaza Strip. So here is the strip, it goes between 0 and 1, and so this distance is normalized to 1, the maximum distance, and so before 0 and after 1 there is certainty. So before 0 there is state A, and after 1 there is state B, and they have a dispute where the border line, how to allocate the territory between 0 and 1. So they may choose this, for instance. And the first state, state A, would like to expand in that direction, and state B would like to expand in that direction. So they have opposing interests. This is the dispute. So how do we model this? Well, in general, so let's define X as an element of this set, which is the point where the borderline is fixed. And then we say that state A prefers X to be as large as possible, and state B prefers X to be as small as possible. So, in general, the utility of state A will be increasing in X, and the utility of B will be increasing in y minus X, or decreasing in X. In order to make the math as simple as possible, we just say that the utility of A is X, and the utility of B is 1 minus X. Otherwise, it could be some monotone, strictly increasing function of X and of 1 minus X. And then, for reasons that will become clear afterwards, we say that there can be also some numeraire good, money, some other some valuable resource that can be of interest for each state. So, and we denote the availability of money for A as NA and for B as NB. So remember, we discuss as if states were individual actors, and we do not discuss the problems within the government, whether the government is benevolent or not. So the model is very general. I will talk about states, but we can then see that we can also talk about autocrats, about political elites, about dictators, as you wish. Okay, so this is the utility that is obtained by the states in the case of peace. And it will depend where the borderline is set. So, they have also the possibility to go to war. We assume that they have already an army and weapons, and each state has the possibility to go to war. And we assume that if war happens, then it is decisive. That is to say, this is also for simplicity only. We assume that either state A wins the war or state B wins the war. There is no possibility of a situation of equal strength in the battlefield. However, the outcome is random. That is to say, there are exogenous random shocks that can affect the ability to win and that are not known ex ante. So since the military power of the states may be different, the probability ex ante for a state to win the war may be different from 1/2. And we denote the probability that state A wins the war by P lowercase. So that 1 minus P is the probability for B to win the war. So the state that wins the war chooses X. So this means that if A wins the war, of course, it will set the borderline at X equals 1. Whereas if X loses the war, state B will set the borderline at X equals 0. So, if war happens, there are destruction, fatalities, and so on. And each state has a different cost for such a war. The number of casualties may be different. And we normalize the cost in such a way that the cost for country J, A or B, is some number which is also between 0 and 1, so that it can be made comparable to the benefit from victory in the war. So as I said before, the model is abstract, and then in fact it is also general. So the interpretation of X as territory is not the only one. So X could be also something different. For instance, it could be the exploitation of some natural resources, or it could be, for instance, the decision about the international position of the countries, so like Ukraine and Russia. So this is the general type of interpretation. Okay, so the states then have this dispute. They know what is involved, and they have the possibility to commit to an international treaty about the open issue, that is to say, about fixing X. We assume that they start from some status quo. The status quo we denote by X0, and then they have some endowment of M of money, which by for simplicity is equal for both. This is also not important. So the questions that we are interested in is whether A and B can find a peaceful agreement, or is war inevitable, and if agreements can be found, how do they look like? So first of all, we must make sure that waging war is indeed a credible threat. And this is a credible threat if at least one state would indeed prefer to go to war rather than sticking to the status quo. In this case, war is a credible threat. So let's take state A. The utility of state A was given by X plus money, which is the right-hand side. X0 is the status quo plus the money. So what is the expected utility of state A if it wages war? Well, with probability P, state A will win the war. And if it wins the war, it will set the borderline X equal to 1. So we have the first term on the left-hand side here. With the complementary probability, it will lose the war. In that case, B will set the borderline equal to 0. So that this is the utility in the case of war defeat in war. So, and in any case, there is the cost, the sunk cost of war, the casualties, the expected casualties, which have the cost CA, and then there is the money. So, state A prefers war as compared to the status quo if the left-hand side is larger than the right-hand side, which is to say if the status quo is sufficiently unpleasant for state A, which means that x0 is small, and in particular if it is smaller than P minus CA. So here you see that if you are very powerful in military terms, P will be large, and so this is likely to be the case. And if you discount casualties, you do not care very much, then CA is low, and then is also tend to be the case. So it was said that Mao Zedong, when China was threatened of a nuclear attack by the United States, at some international meeting, replied that, well, what do 300 million deaths mean for China? So we have so much people that it is not that bad. So this would be a case in which CA is small. So you can do the same for the opponent, and then you get the symmetric outcome. The symmetric outcome using the same logic, which is that the opponent would prefer war to the status quo if x0 is much closer to 1. In this case, if x0 is larger than P plus CB. And the same type of incentives can be found here as for state A. So you see that apparently, since CA and CB are positive, you cannot satisfy both inequalities simultaneously, but you can satisfy one of them, and this is what we assume. Because if no, for instance, if the costs of war, CA and CB, are very large, then neither can be satisfied. We assume that at least one is satisfied, so that the war threat is indeed credible. So what does it mean?
Why cannot be both satisfied if CA is very large? I mean, for A it is clear.
So here, well, we will have, so say that this here is P, then P minus CA must be to the left, and P plus CB must be to the right. So for instance here and here. So if you satisfy the first inequality, it means that you are here, and then it is impossible that you are here. If x0 is smaller than P minus CA, it cannot be larger than P plus CB.
why again is the second equation x0 bigger than p plus cb the preference of b? I mean, x0 is for b what he can win, right?
Yeah, so it's, well, you can derive it, so with probability p, with probability p, state A wins the war, and set x equal to 1. So this means that for state B, the utility will be 1 minus 1. And then with the probability 1 minus P, state B will win the war. And it will set x equal to 0. So that the utility of B will be 1 minus 0. And then we have plus m minus cb, and in the case of liking war compared to status quo, it must be better than the utility of the status quo. In the status quo we have x0, so that the utility of b is 1 minus x0 plus m. So this is 0, and then we have 1 minus p, 1 and 1 goes away, and then we have m and m go also away, and then we took x0 here, and this means x0 larger than, and then we can move minus p to the right hand side and minus cb, and then we have plus p plus cb. Okay, so then we have a situation in which one country is unsatisfied with the status quo and would prefer to go to war rather than sticking to the status quo. So now the country says, well, if you do not change the status quo, I will go to war. And we see that war causes cost, CA and CB. So what will the countries, the states do? Well, they can avoid war by setting a new borderline which is in the range, in some interval between these two values. So, for instance, let's say that it is state A, which is aggressive, and say that at the beginning x0 was very close to 0. X0 was smaller than P minus CA, which means that as compared to going to war, state A would, compared to status quo, state A would have waged war. So, and then they meet, state A and state B, they can commit to a new borderline, and well, indeed, they have plenty of possibilities to find a peaceful agreement, because every borderline in this interval makes them better off as compared to the fallback option, which is war. We said that country A, so to speak, so the minimal settlement for country A, so that the country is happy with the settlement, as compared to the possibility to go to war, is P minus CA. So this is really the reservation value, so to speak. And of course, the more to the right we draw the new borderline, the happier is country A. But actually, it is enough to give country A P minus CA. So in P minus A, it is indifferent between war and agreeing the new borderline there. For country B, it is the reverse. So for country B, well, the more it goes to 0, the better. But actually, avoiding war is very worthwhile, so that actually it would be indifferent already between having war and getting P plus CB as the new borderline. So at this point, state B would be indifferent. And of course, the more we go to the left, the happier is country B. So this means that all points between P minus CA and P plus CB are preferred by both states as compared to the war gamble. Okay? So that in such a situation, we would expect that war does not arise. If all implicit and explicit assumptions that we made are valid, then we would never assume, never predict that war arises. The countries will find some settlement, some X star in that range, so that no war occurs and both are made better off as compared to the case of war. There will be changes compared to the status quo, but the important point is that there will be no war. So these are the answers that we give to the questions that we asked before. So wars would never occur, and the settlements, the settlement, how would it look like? Well, it would be in this interval. This means that, of course, given the asymmetry between the two states, the relative strength in the bargaining table will determine where we locate the new borderline. So the stronger the power, the military power of country A, this means the larger P. If we increase P, what happens? Well, we shift this range to the right. So this is what we expect. If the military strength of country A increases as compared to B, then the settlement is going to be more favorable to country A. And what about the casualties, the cost of war? Well, here also the effect is what you would expect. So if your casualties, because country A and your cost of war decrease, this is the same. This point will shift to the right. And if the cost for your enemy in case of war increase, this also will go to the right. So that the bargain will be more favorable to A, the smaller its own cost of war, and the larger the cost of war of the enemy. So which point will be selected here? Well, this depends on the bargaining procedure, on the ability to bargain. And in game theory, you know that we have models for this. So we have both cooperative and non-cooperative bargaining models. So the Nash solution, not to be confused with the Nash equilibrium, the Nash solution, so the Nash bargaining solution would predict that they, so to speak, divide in equal parts the surplus from the agreement. So in this simple model, it would mean that the new borderline would be in the middle of this interval. So this would be the case if there is a mediator, super partes, and the mediator believes that the fair allocation is determined by the Nash bargaining solution. We have also non-cooperative models of bargaining. So there is the Rubinstein model, which is a game in which offers and counter-offers are made at each period of time, and each party then has the possibility to either accept or reject, and if it rejects, it may either break the negotiation or make a counter-offer. And so there is a sequence.
What's the name again?
Rubinstein bargaining model. Like the classical pianist. So, peace comes from Latin pax, and pax, pax romana for instance, pax has the same etymological root as pactum. Pax, pactum, peace, pactum. And this is precisely what makes peace. Yeah? So peace derives from a bargain, pactum. It is different from a ceasefire. Ceasefire is just a truce. It does not resolve the dispute. Here the dispute is resolved. Because once we have set the borderline at some point in this interval, then no credible threat of war is possible, and so long as the external circumstances will be changed, then there will be no war. Whereas a truce or a ceasefire is just a tactic within a conflict that will go on. Okay. So this is already the model from which we start in order to explain war. So, are there questions about this? Okay, so given the assumptions of this model, we cannot expect war. So war must obtain if at least one of the assumptions are violated. Of course, more than one assumption can be violated. So now we will discuss explanations that are not mutually exclusive, but in order to understand them better, we use the standard analytic procedure. That is to say, discussing one, forgetting the others. Okay. So, yes.
Yeah, I read just the beginning of the Farron paper also, and
Only the beginning.
yes, yes. I continue. And what was missing for me a little bit is the uncertainty of war, because I think there are so many things that can happen, and if you look at longer wars in history, you could also, that go for several years, you could also say at some points, okay, this would have happened different, maybe there was another outcome, the other party would have won. So the probability that we have here P, I think sometimes no party has any idea of what P would look like, because it's so uncertain.
Yes. So we will, this is explanation number 4 that we will discuss.
Okay.
Okay, so the simplest violation of the assumption of the model is, so we implicitly assume that the states are rational actors, that they understand what's going on and that they act in a rational way. So keeping in sight what their interests are and what their means, what available means they have. So this is a standard notion of rationality, that ends and means are mutually consistent. Of course, this outcome could be violated, the peaceful outcome, if at least one side is crazy. So if one state lacks reason, in the sense that the state acts impulsively, without taking into account the fact that actually it could reach a bargain such that the outcome is better than war, of course we can have war. And the laymen often think, well, so they are crazy and they do this because they are crazy, Hitler was mad, and Stalin was mad, everybody was mad. So this is a very naive and infantile view of the world. And indeed, so historians put forward that in general the decisions about starting a war are not just the outcome of some instantaneous emotion, but they have been pondered a lot by the leadership and the advisors of states. So that this first explanation for war is not very appealing. So it seems to contradict both the empirical historical record and what we may expect from if we think that war is an important outcome. Okay, so now let's come to somewhat more interesting explanations. So we assumed that the costs of war, CA and CB, are strictly positive, so that the decision maker suffers a utility loss from war, which is of course the straightforward assumption to make if we think, for instance, of governments as being responsive to the interests of the people. However, it may be that these costs are negative, which is to say that the states derive a utility addition from war. And in this case, it may be so that the range becomes void. The bargaining range becomes void. So, as an example, so just to start from the purely formal side, so mathematically, assume that CA is negative, not only negative, but it is so large that it is the positive utility derived from war by state A is even larger than the negative utility derived from war for state B. So this means that P minus CA is larger than P because CA becomes negative. And since minus CA is larger than CB, it goes to the right of P plus CB, and so the bargaining range has disappeared. So the range of all possible Pareto improvement, this bargaining range is the range of all settlements that are a Pareto improvement as compared to war. So, so this we see, of course, yes, mathematically, this is undeniably true, but in practice, what do we learn from this thought experiment? Well, remember that, as I said before, we are not assuming benevolent decision makers. So decision makers that are benevolent with respect to their domestic population. So it can be the case that the decision makers profit from war. So in general, decision makers in such situations claim that they are pursuing the national interest. But in general, what is the national interest? The national interest is just the special interest of those domestic sectors that are in a position to determine the policy of the country. For instance, in Prussia, for many centuries, the Junker were determining the policy, but the Junker was a tiny minority, maybe 3% of the Prussian population. But the national interest to them was what was good for them, the Junker. The East India Company had a strong impact on British colonial policy decisions. But the British Indian Company was a handful of people, not the British population. So, so there is a very well-known historical treaty on imperialism by Hobson. I think published at the beginning of last century. It's a historical work on British Empire colonialism during the 18th century. And Hobson, in a rather detailed way, describes what he calls the parasitic groups of imperialism, which are those investors and financial speculators that could work their will in the arena of politics and get the British government to do what was in their interest. So that benevolent governments in general, in historical perspective, are not the rule, but rather the exception. So this we call sometimes a war bias of the political leadership, or the political elite. So this is also similar to what I said, I think the first week when I quoted Eisenhower, speaking at the end of his presidential term about the military-industrial complex. For the fact that many people in government, then by means of a revolving doors mechanism, then after serving as servants of the government, they then get lucrative jobs in the military, in defense procurement business. And on top of this, there may be other effects. For instance, the attachment to some ideal vision of the country, so that by identifying with the country, some politicians want to achieve the glory that is bestowed upon them in case of a military victory. Doesn't matter how much it costs. So, of course, last century was a very heavy testimony to this. So, we cannot discount this possibility. The There is also a psychoanalytic explanation for possibility of the joy of fighting. So Freud himself, he thought that giving outlet to repressed instincts was a facilitatory mechanism, not the most important one. So he thought that war was not determined by this, but that support for war could be improved by exploiting the existence of repressed wishes and fears in people. Standard example in psychoanalysis is the paranoid elaboration of mourning. This means the case in which there is a loss, for instance, a collective loss. So normally it is an individual loss. If there is an individual loss, for instance, the loss of the good mother in the works by Melanie Klein, which is maybe the most important psychoanalyst in the study of child psychology. And the loss of the good mother, which entails feelings of guilt and causes suffering. And then the people tend to look for scapegoats around them, so that they can transfer their guilt and the evil that they feel inside them to some other figures. And normally this works at the individual level, but when individuals form a group, this is everything more powerful and different. So first of all, there can be a collective loss, like Germany after the Versailles Treaty, the loss of territory. And this loss may have caused also guilt feelings and projecting those guilt feelings upon foreigners would be a way to discharge this suffering. So that all evil that is in oneself, it is transferred outside. And since you are doing this all together, you are not responsible for these ugly feelings towards the foreigners. So as a private person, you would never go to your neighbor and steal garden things, for instance, if he's not there. But if you are a colonial power and all your national fellow men are in favor of stealing territory from some indigenous population, then you feel no moral pressure anymore. So you're in a group, and this is what makes groups so dangerous. Okay. And in general, also the debates that we have today in this realm are very often debates at a very infantile level. So, for instance, the conflict Russia-Ukraine very often in the media is often a debate that seems to have people from kindergarten. And indeed, this also, for the small child, the figures of the parents are, when the child was small, are the most important things. And what the child admires are power and bigness. So that if you take away some piece of land of your country, then it is like a violation of your bigness and power. And the small child reacts in a very extremist way. Okay, so I think this is a possibility that is empirically relevant in many cases. The fact that there is a wall bias and that some repressed instincts may lead people to be very aggressive towards out groups. However, it is unclear if these are always large enough in order to outweigh the huge cost of work. The question is?
Yeah, would it make sense to say that this explanation for waging was more rational than the first one we discussed, or are both irrational?
No, well, so if we take now, so this second one is difficult to classify because it involves the unconscious. But if we take this one, this is a rational explanation. So it's rational from the viewpoint of those who own a lot of shares of a weapon industry to push for war because they can make a lot of money. So it's rational. Individually rational, of course. Okay. So now there is a third aspect that we implicitly assumed, no, we explicitly assumed, that is also crucial in order to avoid war, which is that X could be set in any point within this issue space, 0, 1. So this means that, so to speak, there is a very fine possibility to grade the agreement, to set agreement. In some situations, it may be, however, so that the issue is, to speak, indivisible. So, take the case Ukraine in NATO or not, 0 or 1. So, in the first approximation, is an indivisible issue. You cannot say a little bit in NATO. So let us look at this possibility of this possible explanation in a formal way first. So one possibility would be to say, well, assume that we can only choose 0 and 1. There is only 0 and 1. For instance, the status quo is 0. And we can either move to 1 or stay to 0, but in between it is impossible. To some extent, also the geography of disputes indeed may lead to some discontinuities like this, because building fortifications is not really possible everywhere. So in some geographies it is easy, but in other situations it's not that easy. The Chinese chose where to build their wall, so maybe some kilometers more north was not possible. So, if indeed only 0 and 1 are possible, and P minus A and P plus CB are strictly inside the set, we are done, in the sense that there is no chance to have a Pareto improvement for both, a Pareto improvement as compared to war. And then at least then one side will have an interest to wage war, and we cannot compensate that side without having the other side preferring war. So what can we say about this? Well, this is where the money comes in that we introduced before. Money is something that can be divided in very tiny amounts. So that actually, if money also matters, actually this explanation of war is not very convincing, because you can always find a way to compensate the other without going to war. Then, for instance, in a case like this, you may either, so in which you have the status quo 0, you may either have a situation in which you stick to 0, but then you have B will have to pay A in order not to wage war, or you change to 1 and then A pays B in order not to go to war. And you can always find a money transfer such that both prefer the situation of 0 or 1 plus the money transfer rather than war. So it is like selling an object. You have to find out which party has the highest willingness to pay for the object, and then this party will get the object and pay the other side, like in the market.
But yeah, there might be some things that you cannot really trade in money, like if in history some countries wanted to invade another country for the territory, but there are people living, and the people say, we want to leave our home where we lived for centuries, and we would rather die than living here. So I think this would be difficult to make a contract for.
Right. This would raise the willingness to pay for staying there. So this means that they would like to pay a lot for staying there. And then, if this is indeed the optimal location of the object, of the territory, then they can agree to stay there and then to pay. Of course, they have to have enough money to pay. Enough money.
If they don't,
Yes. You had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm, because there are so many cases in the history that when the nations chose to pay invader, not to fight against the invader instead. So yeah, there are so many cases when the nations feel like small and tiny and weak, then they still somehow usually choose to pay because they don't have enough power to fight against.
Yes.
Well, in this case, if we go back to the Russia and Ukraine case, like theoretically, joining NATO, that would be one, but paying out to Russia, not to invade. Would that be?
Yes.
Is there any calculation of how much money should that be potentially, theoretically?
Well, so I think the important lesson is that also in the case of Ukraine and Russia, we have a multidimensional conflict. So there are many lines of disagreement where settlements can be found. For instance, Ukraine would like also to join the European Union. Russia would prefer not to, but it seems that it would be ready to accept it. So, then there are issues about, say, the use of gas, which is coming from Russia and through pipelines. So how much to pay, how much should be paid in order to have the transit right for Russian gas on the Ukraine. So that this, beyond simply paying money, which nowadays maybe it's not as feasible as it was in the past. So there are several other dimensions that can be used in order to compensate one side or the other. So whether NATO membership should be part of the agreement or not, well, it depends on the willingness to pay, or the relative willingness to pay of the two actors. So in general, the object should go, so it is efficient if the object goes to the party with the highest willingness to pay. So is the Russian willingness to pay for Ukraine staying outside NATO bigger or smaller than they are recorded? I would say it is larger, but this is just my intuition, and I know no computation.
I was just wondering where like the Imperial Japan in the Second World War fit into this. Like I watched an interview of, I think it was the Minister of Defense in Nakamura, ex-minister, explained that the atomic bomb was impossible to avoid, which I felt like was kind of weird, but would Japan be on this case in the disability of the issue, where you cannot stop them fighting by any other means by compensation?
Well,
It's theoretically it would also be possible to just demand payment.
so what is the indivisible issue here? This example.
The war is over, but you cannot kind of convince the other side to stop fighting.
So you mean that the situation in 1945, when it was clear that Japan was defeated?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like, it is already war, but in this sense, like, it was already kind of, not really peace, but the war is kind of over. You still have the problem of where the issue is not solvable.
Well, I'm not so sure that what the attempts were to reach a peace agreement before dropping the atom bombs. So I read that so in the chief commanders group of the US forces, actually the majority of the members thought that dropping the bombs were not necessary in order to win the war, and it was not necessary to have a large-scale invasion with US troops, because this was the justification that was given after. So the justification by the US was we had to save US lives, and the only possibility was to use the atom bomb, otherwise a full-scale invasion would have cost a lot of US lives. So I'm not aware of the bargaining going on between the US and Japan before this. Okay.
What do you mean for the party who has the higher willingness to pay? Yeah, you said Russia has probably, or maybe a higher willingness to pay than the EU. And what follows from this? Then this party.
No, then Ukraine. That's not the EU.
Okay, or Ukraine. Then this party who has a higher willingness to pay does what? Or
well, it should get it. So it's like an object in an auction, no? So the one has
so it gets it, and the other party pays the smaller sum.
but you get it, but you have to pay. You get it, but you have to pay. And you have to pay at least as much as, so that the other prefers to getting the payment and stay peaceful rather than the war.
So in this case, I think Putin thinks that part of Ukraine is historically part of Russia, And so he thinks rather in centuries, or in at least in decades or centuries, how this part of the land can be useful to Russia. So I think it's nearly impossible to weigh this in money. How much worse is it to him if he loses control of Ukraine? Like before, they were influencing the country. They had political.
So we will have a class on the conflict, on the Ukrainian conflict, I think in the beginning of January. So, because one has to go into the details, so it's. All right. So I suggest that we take now a break, a 10 minutes break.